Satutuinthi. January 17, 1943. North Atlantic, 41° none. 52 Kyontituantin, Ituan. The U-boat commander pressed his eye against the periscope's rubber seal, salt spray still clinging to the lens from the last surface run. Dawn was breaking cold and gray across the Atlantic swells, and through the magnified circle of his vision, he counted ships. 1, 3, 7, 12. He twisted the handles, scanning the horizon in systematic sweeps. 20, 35. His breath caught. 47 vessels steaming in formation, their hulls riding low with cargo, their bows cutting white furrows through the dark water. He had been hunting these convoys for 18 months, since the golden days when the wolf packs could sink tonnage faster than Britain could replace it. But something had changed. The convoys had grown larger, and larger still, and now, impossibly, they seemed endless. He called his executive officer to the periscope, needing confirmation that his eyes weren't deceiving him. "Wie viele?" the younger man whispered after a long silence. "How many?" The commander had no answer. They had stopped being able to count. 3 years earlier, in the winter of 1940, the Kriegsmarine had studied the numbers with Prussian precision and concluded that victory was mathematically inevitable. Britain imported nearly 68 million tons of supplies annually by sea. Food, fuel, steel, ammunition, everything required to sustain an island nation at war. German naval intelligence calculated that sinking 750,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would sever Britain's Atlantic lifeline within a year. The U-boats, those gray wolves of the deep, had proven devastatingly effective. In the first 4 months of 1941 alone, they sent more than 2 million tons to the ocean floor. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, spoke with the confidence of a man who had done his arithmetic. Destroy their merchant fleet faster than they can build replacements, and Britain would starve. The equation was simple. The outcome was certain. The German submariners called it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, and they painted white tonnage silhouettes on their conning towers, proud tallies of the ships they had killed. But the equation had a variable the Germans had not adequately considered: America. Not America as it existed in 1940, an industrial power still clinging to peacetime production and isolationist sentiment, but America as it would become when fully awakened to total war. The transformation would be so rapid, so overwhelming in scale, that even those orchestrating it would struggle to believe their own statistics. And for the German sailors who had grown accustomed to hunting fat, slow merchantmen across empty oceans, the confrontation with American industrial abundance would feel less like naval warfare and more like watching the laws of nature rewritten before their eyes. The challenge was unprecedented in the history of warfare. By late 1942, Allied merchant losses to U-boats approached 7 million tons. Tankers carrying fuel from Texas refineries, freighters loaded with Canadian grain, or carriers hauling bauxite from South America, all were being sent to the bottom at a rate that exceeded every pre-war projection. British shipyards, even working at capacity, could produce perhaps 1.5 million tons of new merchant shipping per year. The mathematics of attrition favored Germany. Unless something changed, the Atlantic would become an Axis lake, and Britain would face surrender not through defeat in battle, but through simple starvation. Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. The Prime Minister understood numbers. He could see the column of losses rising higher than the column of construction, month after month, the gap widening like a wound that wouldn't close. America's answer emerged not from naval architects or military strategists, but from a shipyard owner who had never built an ocean-going vessel in his life. Henry Kaiser was a California industrialist who had made his fortune constructing dams in the desert. a man who thought in terms of concrete and earth movers, not steel and seawater. When the Roosevelt administration approached him in 1940 about building merchant ships, Kaiser knew almost nothing about maritime engineering. But he knew everything about mass production, assembly line efficiency, and the systematic reduction of complexity. He looked at the problem of merchant ship construction the way he had looked at Boulder Dam, as a manufacturing challenge, not a craft tradition. And with that fundamental reorientation of perspective, he prepared to turn shipbuilding into something the world had never seen, an industrial process operating at automotive scale. Traditional shipbuilding was an art form measured in years. A standard cargo vessel required 12 to 18 months from keel laying to launch, constructed by skilled craftsmen who shaped each piece of the hull individually, fitting plates together like a vast metal puzzle. Kaiser threw out the entire paradigm. He broke ship construction into prefabricated sections that could be manufactured simultaneously in different locations, then assembled like building blocks in massive dry docks. He hired workers from automotive plants and aircraft factories, people who knew nothing about ships but everything about repetitive industrial processes. He designed jigs and templates that allowed semi-skilled laborers to produce identical components with precision. He studied the construction sequence and identified every bottleneck, every wasted motion, every minute of unnecessary time. Then he eliminated them with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had carved tunnels through mountains. The result was the Liberty ship, a standardized cargo vessel of 441 feet and 14,000 tons capacity. It was not beautiful. Naval architects considered it crude, a utilitarian box with a propeller, lacking the elegant lines of traditional maritime design. The ships were welded rather than riveted, a faster technique that traditional shipbuilders distrusted. They had old-fashioned reciprocating steam engines instead of modern turbines, making them slow. They were called ugly ducklings and sea cows, and professional mariners initially refused to sail in them, convinced the welded hulls would crack in heavy seas. But none of that mattered, because Kaiser could build them in 42 days, then 30 days, then 2 weeks, and on one publicity-driven occasion in November 1942, his Richmond, California yard assembled the SS Robert E. Peary from keel to launch in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. The Germans did not believe the reports at first. Intelligence assessments dismissed American production claims as propaganda. 4 days to build a ship? Impossible. Even the most efficient German yards required 8 months. The numbers had to be fabricated, a clumsy attempt at psychological warfare. But then the convoys began to swell. Where there had been 30 ships, now there were 50, then 70. Then formations so large they stretched beyond the horizon, protected by destroyer screens that seemed to multiply like spawn. U-boat commanders who had once hunted isolated targets now faced armadas, and even when they succeeded in torpedoing a freighter, another would take its place in the formation within days, as though the Americans could simply conjure vessels from the air. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. Not 3 per week, 3 per day. 18 Kaiser-built yards operated along the West Coast, along with dozens of other facilities in Maine, Alabama, Texas, Pennsylvania. At peak production, the United States was constructing merchant vessels at a rate that exceeded 50,000 tons daily. In the time it took a German submarine to return from patrol, America had added more shipping tonnage than the U-boat had sunk in 3 months. The equation Dönitz had calculated so carefully was collapsing. The Allies weren't losing the tonnage war. They were winning it by a margin that grew wider every week. But the Liberty ships were only the beginning. Kaiser's yards produced them in a standardized hulls like automobiles rolling off Ford's assembly line. But the military required specialized vessels too. Tankers for fuel, attack transports for amphibious assaults, repair ships, hospital ships, cargo vessels modified to carry locomotives or aircraft or live ammunition. So the yards produced those as well, in the same mass quantities, using the same prefabrication techniques. Kaiser built T2 tankers that could haul 16,000 tons of oil across the Pacific. He built escort carriers, small aircraft carriers constructed on merchant hulls, at a rate of 1 per week. The Richmond yards alone launched 747 vessels during the war years. The entire American maritime industry produced 5,577 merchant ships, totaling 56 million tons. It was industrialization applied to maritime warfare, with a totality that seemed to violate the normal constraints of time and resources. The U-boat crews experienced this abundance as existential horror. They had been told they were fighting a war of attrition, that mathematics and willpower would prevail. Instead, they found themselves drowning in Allied shipping, watching their kill counts become meaningless, as faster than they could destroy the merchant fleet. More ships appeared. A commander who had sunk 8 vessels in a patrol, what would have been a triumph in 1941, returned to base only to learn that America had launched 45 ships that same week. The tonnage board, once a source of pride, became a mockery. What did it matter if you sent 50,000 tons to the bottom when the enemy added 250,000 tons in the same period? And always, the Liberty ships kept coming. They carried the machinery of war in quantities that seemed divorced from reality. A single Liberty ship could transport 440 light tanks, or 2,040 jeeps, or enough steel to build a destroyer, or flour sufficient to bake 11 million loaves of bread. They hauled locomotives to Russia, bombers to Australia, powdered eggs to Britain. They transported entire prefabricated oil refineries. They carried the raw materials to build airfields on Pacific islands that had been nothing but coral and jungle. When Douglas MacArthur's forces needed supplies in New Guinea, Liberty ships brought them. When the Red Army required American trucks and canned meat, Liberty ships delivered them via Murmansk. When invasion planners needed to pre-position mountains of ammunition and gasoline for the Normandy landings, Liberty ships became the warehouse. The vessels were everywhere, in every theater, a gray armada that seemed to reproduce spontaneously. For German sailors who had been raised on narratives of Teutonic efficiency and Allied decadence, the encounter with American productive capacity carried ideological weight beyond the merely military. They had been taught that democracy was weak, that free societies lacked the discipline for total war, that the Reich's centralized planning and martial spirit would triumph over the chaotic individualism of the West. The U-boat service had seen itself as an elite force, technically superior, tactically brilliant, operating on the cutting edge of naval warfare. But what did technical superiority matter when the enemy could afford to lose 3 ships for every one you sank and still gain ground? What did tactical brilliance achieve when the target-rich environment simply grew richer every month? The Liberty ships were not superior vessels. In fact, they were objectively inferior in almost every measure of naval architecture. But there were thousands of them. And in that numerical vastness, in that sheer overwhelming abundance, lay a truth about industrial democracy that no amount of propaganda could refute. The symbolic power of those ugly welded hulls extended beyond military logistics. They represented a civilization that could marshal resources on a scale the Axis powers could not match. Germany had conquered a continent, but could not outproduce an ocean-away democracy that had been at peace 3 years earlier. Japan had seized the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, but could not replace merchant tonnage as fast as American submarines and aircraft destroyed it. The Liberty ships embodied a fundamental asymmetry in the war. The Allies could afford to be wasteful, could accept losses, could try and fail and try again, because behind the front lines lay an industrial base so vast that it could absorb catastrophic destruction and continue expanding. Admiral Dönitz realized the impossibility of his situation by late 1943. Even if every U-boat sank twice as many ships, an impossible goal, America would still increase the size of the Allied merchant fleet. The mathematics had inverted. By the spring of 1944, the U-boats were being hunted faster than they could hunt. Allied air cover had closed the mid-Atlantic gap, where submarines had once operated with impunity. Escort carriers, many of them Kaiser-built, provided air patrols that tracked U-boats and called in destroyer attacks. Radar had improved. Depth charges had become more lethal. And always, behind the screen of warships, the convoys grew larger. The Liberty ships sailed in formations of 80 or 90 vessels, their holds crammed with supplies for the impending invasion of France. A U-boat commander who managed to penetrate the destroyer screen and sink a single freighter had achieved nothing meaningful. Another ship would take its place before the crew's bodies washed ashore. The U-boat service, which had begun the war, with the confidence of mathematical certainty, ended it with casualty rates exceeding 70%. Of the 1,162 U-boats built by Germany, 785 were destroyed. Of the 40,000 men who served in the submarine force, 28,000 died at sea. They were not defeated by superior tactics or better technology. They were defeated by an enemy who could build merchant ships faster than the submarines could find torpedoes to sink them with. The Liberty ships themselves suffered losses. Of the 2,710 Liberties constructed, 200 were sunk by enemy action, and another 31 lost to weather and accidents. But the yards built them faster than the enemy could destroy them, and the survivors continued sailing for decades after the war, carrying commercial cargo across the same oceans where they had once dodged torpedoes. Some served into the 1970s, these supposedly crude vessels outlasting their critics. They had been designed for a war of attrition, built to be expendable, constructed with the assumption that many would be lost. But they had been built in such numbers that their losses became irrelevant to the strategic calculation. That was the deeper lesson, the truth encoded in every welded seam. Abundance could be a weapon more powerful than precision, and the capacity to absorb loss could matter more than the ability to avoid it. In the end, the Liberty ships represented something profound about the nature of the conflict and the civilization that produced them. They were not the product of martial culture or authoritarian efficiency. They emerged from a society that valued problem-solving over tradition, that embraced improvisation, that trusted semi-skilled workers to master new techniques, that applied mass production principles to tasks that had always been considered artisanal. They were built in yards that had never constructed ships before, by workers who had been farmers and clerks and homemakers months earlier, using techniques that violated centuries of maritime practice. They were democracy industrialized, imperfect, pragmatic, overwhelming. And when that industrial democracy focused its full attention on the problem of supplying a global war, it produced miracles measured in tonnage statistics. The U-boat commander, who had counted 47 ships in January 1943, survived the war, one of the lucky minority. In the decades after, he would occasionally see a Liberty ship in commercial service, riding high in the water without its wartime cargo, weathered and rust-streaked, but still functional. And each time, he would remember that moment at the periscope, counting hulls until the count became meaningless, trying to comprehend a scale of production that his training had never prepared him to imagine. They had fought bravely, sunk tonnage, followed orders with discipline and skill, but they had been trying to empty an ocean with torpedoes while the enemy poured rivers of steel back in. The war had not been decided by courage or technical brilliance. It had been decided by the capacity of free labor and industrial abundance to turn ships into a renewable resource, to make the temporary permanent, to transform the impossible into the merely difficult. and then to do it 3 times a day, every day, until the tonnage board meant nothing, and the equation collapsed, and the only mathematics that mattered was the simple fact that one side had more of everything and could afford to spend it. That was the lesson written in welded hulls across 10,000 miles of ocean. When abundance becomes strategy, scarcity loses.